In our book Breakthrough, we wanted to ask the question of how do you deal with a huge, complicated global problem like global warming. What we want to do here, and where Breakthrough is headed, is to raise a larger conversation about what is the meaning of liberalism in a developed society like the United States. Liberalism, the political liberalism, or what we call progressive politics, mostly came of age during the Great Depression, when people didn't have enough food to eat, and when a basic kind of Keynesian stimulus worked to stimulate the economy, get people back to work, and then of course World War II had an even bigger stimulative effect. The world we live in today is obviously vastly different, both than the Great Depression. We don't have the kind of hunger in the United States that we had in the Great Depression. We have a bigger problem with obesity than we have with hunger. And at the same time, we're not at the top of the heap like we were after World War II. We're a competitor in a global marketplace. And those two things are related. Both how do we deal with inequality in the United States and poverty in the United States at the same time that we're globally competitive. And part of one of the questions of modernizing liberalism is how do we help how does the United States become a country where there's greater opportunity to pursue the American dream, and that those opportunities are provided in different ways than they were in the past decades. The American dream is at the heart of this. I think it's fair to say that at least half of Americans, if not more, really have lost faith that the American dream is something that can be realized by the average person. That means that people are losing confidence that the next generation is going to be better off than themselves. And that's a very scary thing. That's very unique in the United States. Traditionally, what's been special about the United States is that you've had high rates of social mobility. You have opportunities for working class people to become wealthier, working in factories, for example, leaving the farms or leaving the factories to go into service industries or knowledge industries. The concern now is that in a global economy where workers are increasingly competing with workers in other countries, those opportunities may start to diminish. And I think we're starting to see that. This concern about the fading of the American dream was actually going on for a number of years before the Great Recession, which started in 2008. This is a long-term trend, and it's not an easy one to answer. And I think part of this project of modernizing liberalism means asking the right questions, figuring out what are the right questions to these big problems without imagining that we're going to be able to solve them overnight or solve them without a lot of conversation and dialogue. And part of what Breakthrough Institute is trying to do is widen that conversation, broaden that conversation. So we're a bit unusual for what would be things that most of a liberal think tank would do, in that we like to talk to conservatives about what they think about liberalism. We like to talk to people in different specialties, whether it's national security or the economy, to get their views on how do we need to modernize our politics to compete in what is fairly described as a post-American world, a world where we have intense global competition for industries, for jobs, for future markets. That's a very different challenge than the one that we faced back in the Great Depression or shortly after World War II, when we really had few global competitors. In the project of modernizing liberalism for a post-American world, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what should we be worried about? What are the real risks to our security, to our prosperity, to our global environment? And that's not as straightforward of a question as you might think. There's both a question of what are the objective risks, and we can look at those, and people do those studies. You find that very few people, for example, ever die of terrorism. Far more people, of course, die in their cars. And of course, heart disease and smoking continue to be the big killers. But more than that, we need to ask the question of, why do different people care about different risks? So why do conservatives worry so much more about terrorism, while liberals worry so much more about global warming? Now, of course, a partisan liberal or a partisan conservative would say, well, because terrorism is objectively a greater risk, or the liberal would say objectively global warming is a greater risk. But there's other questions as well. Each of those analyses of risk, we have to look at our own ideological and cultural filters that we bring to understand these problems. And so from risk analysis, we start to get a sense of how these risks are not only uncertain, but also ideologically framed. An important question in dealing with risks is understanding that the risks that we face today in the wealthy world, in the developed world, are really different risks than the ones that we faced as we were developing. And so one of our senior fellows at Breakthrough Institute, Ulrich Beck, has written about what he calls second modern risks. And that's a bit of jargon, but second modern just means how do we developed countries deal with risks, and what are those risks? And what he points out is that the risks that we deal with today are overwhelmingly risks that we ourselves have created. So if first modern risks were things like hunger, material deprivation, being vulnerable to the elements by having inadequate housing, for example, or inadequate infrastructure, the problems that we face in the second modern world or the developed world are really risks that we ourselves have created, like global warming or the risk from energy production, mostly obviously fossil fuel energy production, but also nuclear energy production. Really all energy production comes with risks. And of course climate change, a risk that we ourselves have created for ourselves, and itself an uncertain risk with it's not completely clear whether we're facing serious catastrophic risks or whether we're going to be facing much more moderate risks. Part of the evaluation of risk includes involving the risk of ecological challenges like global warming, habitat destruction, clean water. And that's a complicated conversation for a number of reasons. I think the first is that while environmentalists and Greens have for many decades said that destroying the environment would ultimately destroy economic growth, so far we haven't seen that. So far you've seen a lot of economic growth in places where you have a very degraded environment. Now some might say, well, but the day of reckoning is coming. And obviously ever since Reverend Malthus in the 19th century, people have warned that we're going to overstretch our carrying capacity. Well, we think there's a number of reasons to be skeptical of that, but even there to acknowledge that there are real risks and consequences of modernization. But one question we might want to ask is, why is it that Malthus and Malthusianism really show up in countries that are already developed and in societies that are already fairly wealthy among some of the wealthiest members of that society? We think here that's not a coincidence. There's something going on that would have the very affluent in any society, in case of Malthus in British society in the 19th century, or pretty widespread in the United States, of the view that there's really not enough room on planet Earth for all of us to live this way. And of course, most famously, we saw this in 1968 when the Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And he went on Johnny Carson. It was a famous book. And in it, he said, there is simply no way that India can feed another 200 million people. But of course, that is precisely what India proceeded to do over the next several decades. And it did so because of technology innovation, better seeds, irrigation, better fertilizers. But this raises another question. What does it mean to be sustainable? Is that even the right goal? One of the things that we know from the history of planet Earth is that nature is anything but sustainable. There are all sorts of species extinctions having to do with human beings or not with human beings. Even early hunter-gatherers caused all sorts of extinctions, including the famous woolly mammoth. So what you find is if you really look at the global environment, it's not quite the nature in balance story that traditionally environmentalists have imagined. So one question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we doing when we think about our relationship to the non-human natural world? Are we trying to keep it in balance, or are we trying to create a planet Earth that we want to live on? And that's where a number of very good thinkers have talked about the real project of conservation in the 21st century is around gardening the earth well. It's to recognize the fact that, as Stuart Brand has said, we have become as gods and we might as well get good at it. Peter Kareva, chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, says the old model of parks is not sufficient for managing planet Earth in the way that we need to. There's no getting around the fact that we are, in many ways, in charge of the global ecosystems, and we need to be responsible stewards of them, even while understanding that we're never going to return nature to a state of balance. There's just too much chaos and flux and change, and that really what we're trying to do is create a planet Earth that we want to live on. And that might very well include places on planet Earth that remain completely wild or even completely devoid of human. But it also means understanding that this planet is populated by a dominant species. and that species is going to get its material needs met. The 2008 financial crisis had a lot of progressives and liberals, both in the United States and Europe and around the world, expecting that there would be some serious rethinking of neoclassical economic ideology in its wake. And the reason is that the financial crisis didn't occur from something outside the market, but it really occurred from economic actors in institutions behaving rationally or irrationally, but enough so that it almost brought the global economy to a crash. And so it's been a surprise for many of us who have been critics of neoliberalism to see that really neoclassical economic theory remains dominant. So one question we should ask ourselves is, what is it about neoclassical economic theory that keeps it so dominant in people's minds that it doesn't even allow a criticism or any challenge to it to enter? One of the things that happens as we develop, and especially as prominent in wealthy countries today, is that we've increasingly forgotten the role that government has played in our prosperity and in economic growth. And so whereas maybe after the Great Depression, after World War II, there was an awareness among Americans that government does a lot of things really well, it does a lot of things right, that has faded dramatically here in the United States. It's faded actually in most developed economies. And the reason is that, for example, when we use our cell phones, we credit Apple for making a great smartphone. We don't credit the Defense Department or other government agencies for having pioneered almost all of the major technologies in that piece of equipment. At the same time, we start to feel entitled to public goods that really have required constant investment. So people, famously, the Tea Partiers would hold up signs saying, "Keep the government out of my Medicare." There's sort of a lost sense that Medicare is a public good that we've all invested in. And this was actually a problem that a very good sociologist named Daniel Bell wrote about in the early 70s. He said, as we become wealthier, we become more individuated, more narcissistic, really, and less grateful and less aware of the collective investments in the things that we today take for granted, including our very basic infrastructure, our basic social programs, and our basic prosperity. So I think one of the challenges for modernizing liberalism is to help people to remember that important role that the government and that the collective played in making these investments in order to renew and to find new opportunities to grow America and to make those investments in the future. One of the negative consequences of having so much new media and social media is that we actually end up living in bubbles where we are only talking to people who agree with us. We live in neighborhoods with people who mostly agree with us. We increasingly self-segregate because, of course, it's more comfortable to be talking to people who only share your point of view. So that's what we find. Facebook filters out the folks who you are less resonant with. It happens sort of organically. And so one of the challenges is, how do we overcome these natural media and information bubbles that get created through new media? Of course, the other thing that's going on in the United States is that politically we're more polarized than we've been since Reconstruction. You find the difference between partisans and really the vitriol between partisans sharper today than almost at any other time in American history. And while this might be good for getting nothing done, so if you are someone that opposes collective action in any way, maybe this is a positive thing. But anybody who favors taking strong action to be competitive globally, to invest in the American dream, this is bad news. What you need is some way to bridge that huge partisan divide and some way to work with media toward a more robust dialogue rather than to continue to self-segregate.